Hello everyone, welcome to economics lecture once again. We'd appreciate and value a lot of this time that has been given to us in econs lecture because we know that all of you would then be sitting down in front of a laptops playing these videos that we have painstakingly put up for you. The content and the materials have been concised and put together so that you will be able to learn as efficiently as possible. A lot have happened since the last time we spoke in exchange rate policy. You would have realized from the messages that we have sent that monetary policy and exchange rate policy are no longer going to be examinable. Therefore, it's good news. We don't need to spend so much time in tutorials and lectures to go through those two big policies. But of course, if you are eager and keen to learn more about those policies, you can still speak to us and we'll be more than willing to talk to you about it. The next few slides will be about how the content has been concised, but yet there is still a key thing that we feel that it will be good for you to know, and therefore we will be summarizing the parts in the next two slides, which are important. I just want to talk a little bit about what else is important. If you read the message very carefully that Miss Xu and I have sent to you regarding the common last topic that will be taken out of the H1 exams at the end of the year, you realize that monetary policy and exchange rate policy centered on Singapore's context is now removed. But what is still important is actually we still need you to know how a change in interest rate can affect net exports, because we believe this is still very important. So we, instead of asking you to refer to your monetary policy notes, let me just do a quick sum up so that you don't need to refer here and there, and then you need not go and play Miss Xu's video again and fast forward to this part, which you might missed it as well. So I hope you listen attentively to this part, and once we are cleared with this, we will not talk about changes in interest rate anymore. Alright, so let's say there are two countries, China and USA, and USA being the home country. So in the first place, when they have interest rate of 3% each, there will be no hot money movements, which means there will be no large movements of money, cash, between these two countries. But now, if interest rate in the United States have come down to 2%, it has decreased by 1%, it means that there will be capital flows out of US into China. What does this mean? You see, there are a lot of people with hot money, with very liquid money. They actually deposit their money in banks and they will take it out, withdraw it, and put it in another bank to make a quick buck out of the changes in interest rate. So when the interest rate in Chinese banks are higher by 1%, there will be hot money flows of US out of US into China. And when that happens, there will be a fall in the demand for US dollar. So you might ask me, why not an increase in demand for Chinese currency? Of course, that can happen as well. But what we are interested in is we want to look at USA. Okay, so when that happens, according to the normal shifting of demand and supply, of course, which is now no longer as important for exchange rate, it will result in the depreciation of the US dollar. Okay, so when the demand for US currency falls, it will result in a depreciation of US dollar. Now, with the depreciation, what will happen to the relative prices of exports and imports of USA? So this is what you need to know. Alright, the exports of USA, so American goods, become cheaper in foreign currencies, which means for a Singaporean, for a Chinese, they now find American goods cheaper in their currency. But we phrase it as exports become cheaper in foreign currency because we are seeing from America's perspective, and imports become more expensive in domestic currency. So suddenly to the Americans, the Chinese goods will be relatively more expensive now. Now, given or assuming Marshall-Lerner condition is satisfied, X minus M will therefore increase for America. So what on earth is Marshall-Lerner condition? I don't think you would want to know, because there's a whole page of proving mathematical formulas that are applied and is invented by these two guys called Marshall and Lerner. So we will not look at them. Okay, what you need to do is literally just quote, assuming Marshall-Lerner condition is satisfied, i.e. PDX plus PDM is greater than 1, X minus M will increase. That's what you need to know. Alright, so given a depreciation of the US dollar, X minus M for the United States will increase. So what happens when there's an appreciation? I will leave it to you to work it out with your tutors. So if there's time, you can discuss with your tutors, and when we come to certain questions, and if there's a chance, your tutors can go through as well. Alright, but other than that, this is what you need to know. Okay, so to sum up, what is no longer required is actually interest rate determination, the changes on interest rate on the economy is no longer as important. Limitations of monetary policy, of course, is no longer important. Exchange rate is not important anymore. But what you still need to do, or at least know at the minimum, is the last two slides that I've just shown you. Given a change in interest rate, how it might affect exchange rate, and then subsequently affecting net exports. Okay, so that's what you need to know. All right, so now let's go on to fiscal policy. So I've put in some Slido. Okay, what is Slido? I'm sure you know. So you just have to log into Slido. You don't even have to log in. You just have to go to Slido and go into room number 18823 to key in your questions, and Miss Xu and I will answer you from there, if there are any. And if you feel shy about wanting to message us or ask in the group chats, okay, you can just go on to Slido and ask questions for regarding fiscal policy or any other econs concept. All right, we will try our best to answer you, and you can remain anonymous, or you can give feedback about the lectures, since we are no longer doing reflections for lectures. All right, so I hope you have your fiscal policy notes with you. It's very important. To complement this video, we need your lecture notes. Okay, so this is the lecture overview. Take note, we will ignore automatic stabilizer because this is non-discretionary. We will only look at discretionary fiscal policy, which is this part. Okay, so if you remember the last lecture and in Miss Xu's monetary policy lecture, we talk about the problems that the economy will face, and it's always the patient-doctor analogy that we will give. So a patient could be sick with some macro problems, like for example, unemployment could be high, inflation could be high, and there could be negative growth or non-sustainable, non-sustained economic growth, etc. So because of these problems, which we have spent quite some time talking about these issues, the consequences of it, and what caused these issues, we want to go on to talk about the solutions. And of course, the solutions to these problems have been introduced to you previously under monetary policy, and then I tried talking about exchange rate policy, but now MOE have helped you greatly by removing these two policies. So, what is fiscal policy? Alright, fiscal policy is something that is done by the government relating to government revenue, especially taxes. Alright, so it's about tweaking of taxes and government expenditure. So it is a deliberate attempt to regulate AD and the economy through changes in the fiscal tools. So remember, we talk about demand management policy. This is a typical example of a demand management policy. So I highlight the word deliberate. So something has happened in the economy. It could be a recession, and the government would want to regulate AD, trying to stimulate it by implementing fiscal policy. So in other words, fiscal policy is initiatives by the government trying to regulate AD. And the two fiscal policy tools are government expenditure and taxes. So these are the two fiscal policy tools that the government will impose. Alright, before we continue to talk a little bit more about the fiscal policy tools, namely taxes as well as government expenditure, let us talk about the budget, which is a very hot topic this year given that Minister Heng Swee Keat, our Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, had to come out into Parliament 3 times on 3 different occasions to deliver 3 different budgets. Of course, the later 2 are supplements. So it's the first time in our history that the Finance Minister would have to adjust his budget on 3 occasions. Alright, so what is budget? The budget balance is something to plan for at the start of the year, and at the end of the year, the government will then take stock whether the budget has been adhered to, whether there is a surplus or deficit from the year's activities. So, the budget balance is calculated by government revenue minus government expenditure. And what constitutes the inflow of funds for the government? Namely, taxes. So in 2017, the expected operating revenue through tax collection is about $75.15 billion, which is a very significant amount. So this money comes from income taxes, corporate taxes, ERPs, etc. On the other hand, what constitutes the outflow of funds for the government? Where does the government need to spend on? Government expenditure, namely the construction of bridges, hospitals, roads, schools, etc. So the expected government expenditure is about 73.92 billion. So a quick glance at these figures, you will realize that Singapore's expected budget position going to be in 2017 is going to be a budget surplus. Alright, so what could happen is at the start of the year, the finance minister could announce that we are expected to have a budget surplus. At the end of the year, after the activities throughout the year, the government will then take stock whether the budget surplus has been achieved, accumulated, or somehow bad things happened to the economy and then the government ended up running a budget deficit. So it's always at the start of the year and at the end of the year, or rather at the end of the financial year, that they will look into the budget positions. So what do you think Singapore is going to do with this budget surplus? So in 2017, the year of 2017, at the end of the financial year 2017, which is actually in March 2018, the government actually accumulated a surplus. So what can they do with the surplus? So in Singapore's context, having accumulated a budget surplus in 2017, the financial year of 2017, in 2018, Minister Heng announced Budget 2018, Together a Better Future. So what did he intend to spend on in 2018? He wanted to make Singapore a strategic and integrated place for the future. We want to be a transport hub. We want to be a place where businesses take place around the world. We want to support our transformation into a vibrant and innovative economy. So a lot of money were planned to put into businesses and industries which focus on innovation. And we want to become a smart, green and livable city, while at the same time not forgetting the underprivileged, the low-skilled workers and the low-income group. We do want to help them, or rather the government wants to help them, and they want to create a caring and cohesive city. So this is where the money is going to. The government want to tap on the surplus in 2017 to spend in these areas, at the same time ensuring a fiscally sustainable and secure future for Singapore. So you may ask, what's the purpose of having a government budget? Because some of us could be very frivolous in our spending. The moment we receive our pocket money of $100, for example, from our parents, we would spend it on the same day. So we literally have no financial planning. And if that's the case, you will not appreciate a government's budget. But because the government runs the country, they are accountable to the entire population in the country. They cannot afford to be frivolous in their spending. They have to be careful in their spending. So the key objectives of having a government budget are to raise necessary revenue to cover planned expenditure. You see, only when you have a budget and you would then plan to raise certain taxes so that you can afford and finance the planned expenditure. And more importantly is to encourage office holders to be prudent. If I'm the finance minister, I would have been hearing requests from education minister, defense minister, housing minister to want more money. These ministers are going to want more money for their ministries. But with a allocated amount of funds for them, then they will afford, and they will then have to be mindful, to be prudent, and only spend the money wisely as planned. And of course, it steers the direction of economic activity in the future. Like in every year's budget, there is always a theme. In 2018, it's Together a Better Future. So the focus is actually on inclusive growth in 2018. In fact, the last couple of years before COVID-19, Singapore government has talked a lot about how to create inclusive growth for every Singaporean. And this is included in the budget. Alright, so I'm going to give you 10 seconds for you to look at this table and try activity 1 to think about how we can find out more about the budget. Okay, your 10 seconds begins. Alright, so the question was, in which years did the government run a budget deficit? What is a budget deficit? A budget deficit means that if you still remember the definition, the government expenditure outweighs the government revenue. So you could see clearly that there are 2 years which are rather unique where there is a negative sign, and those negative signs means that they are budget deficits. So in year 2009 and 2015, Singapore government ran budget deficits, which means we spent more than how much we earned. So if GDP is 1 million, government might have spent more than 1 million in the budget, okay, in the fiscal policy. So the next question would be, what could be the reason for the budget deficit? Okay, spend 15 seconds to think about it. What happened in 2009 and what else happened in 2015 that warranted the government to spend more than the GDP? Okay, so I hope you have some reasons. In 2009, there was the global financial crisis. There is a need to pay for the fiscal stimulus package, which our finance minister launched in that time. Alright, during that time. And in 2015, government launched the Civil Support Scheme, trying to help the elderly generation pay for healthcare, transport, etc. So there were a lot of initiatives. And of course, the Changi Airport Terminus, the Jewel, were announced in 2015 to start the construction. And Skills Future was also launched in that particular year. So that resulted in the budget deficit in 2015. So is it worth worrying? Not really, because it's planned for. So that's the difference. A planned budget deficit versus a budget deficit that happened due to economic activities is more worrying. Alright? A planned budget deficit it could be a once-off, and the government actually planned for it, so it is intentional and therefore it's not really a concern. I want to show you the latest news, something that you might be interested to know. In 2020, February 18, this article was published, and it's actually a real world situation due to COVID-19. You will realize that our government is going to launch or implement a budget deficit that is about negative 2.1% of the GDP. Okay, what does this mean? It means that the proportion of Singapore's GDP, 2.1% of it, will be spent as fiscal policy. So of course this is still relatively at the start of the year 2020, which means we are anticipating a budget deficit. We are planning for a budget deficit. At the end of the year, or at the end of the financial year 2020, most probably the budget deficit will happen unless there was a huge, or there is going to be a huge um, surge in economic activities and government managed to collect more taxes than planned, which is quite unlikely. So most likely it will be a budget deficit year. Okay, and you can see the article also mentioned the last time round we had a significant budget deficit was in 2009. All right, because of financial crisis. So it's a like for like comparison. So some remarks for activity 1, which you can jot down, is a question for us to think about. Will Singapore have problem funding her budget deficits? A lot of the politicians have raised concerns, economies as well, that Singapore might not be able to finance our budget deficits if we were to launch one. Especially this year, due to COVID-19, countries around the world are all rolling out huge fiscal stimulus. Some countries won't be able to afford it and they will have to resort to lending. But in Singapore's case, we do not need to borrow. That's one of key characteristics. We have a huge amount of reserves. Alright, and if you remember, just now we talked about the year 2017 where Singapore government had budget surplus. And part of the budget surplus was kept into our reserves, was stored into the reserves. Nobody knows how much our reserves is, how much our reserves is worth, or there are. But what we know is this year the government has to tap into the reserves again. But that's not the problem because we have huge savings, huge amount of savings from past year's budget surpluses. So budget position is a factor that government considers when deciding whether to activate fiscal policy. So that's for you to know. So fiscal policy seems a very easy tool to implement in around the world. When you have a recession, just launch fiscal policy. But the government of the day would have to consider the budget position. If they are running huge budget deficits for continuous years, they might not be able to finance a fiscal policy. So it's something for you to consider. Alright? So some of the data for you to be aware of so that you can see for yourself where Singapore stands. We have an occasional budget deficit and people raise concerns. But these countries have huge budget deficits. Look at Timor-Leste. Negative 76.1%, which means they are spending way into their GDP. Alright, so if you are interested, you can go and Google on these countries. They are usually developing countries with huge debts, and that's why they have little GDP, and at the same time they also have huge debts. Brunei is a relatively welfare state. The government spends a lot of money, free healthcare, free education for all the Bruneians, and that's why they have a huge deficit as compared to the GDP. Alright, but it's a unique country where the GDP is usually gathered by the government, or rather the Sultan actually contributes a lot to the GDP of the country by selling the oil reserves that they have. Okay, so getting to know the budget balances better. So by now you would have realized that this is actually very easy. You can just copy in the blanks. Okay, so just want to make sure that you know the terms. Alright, when revenue exceeds expenditure, we say the government is running a budget surplus. When revenue equals expenditure, which is very unlikely, is called a balanced budget. When expenditure exceeds revenue, we say it's a budget deficit. Okay, so this is very important. You need to know, because especially the first and the third bullet point, because there have been case study questions that will test you on this. They will give you a table, for example, like what I've given you just now, and then you're supposed to comment about the budget position. Alright, so when they ask you about the budget balance or budget position, always tell them first, what is the current position? Is it a surplus or a deficit? Thereafter, then you talk about what is happening to the size of the deficit or surplus. Looking back at this lecture overview, we have talked about the national budget position. Find out more about what on earth is surplus and deficit. We now go on to expenditure. Alright, so what are some of the reasons for government expenditure? Like in which cases do government need to spend? On page 4 of your notes. So the main aims, if you remember last year, we spent quite some time on market failure, resource allocation. That's one of the key objectives of the government, to ensure efficient resource allocation. So the finance and the provision of public goods like national defense, street lighting are all examples of government expenditure. Government needs to spend on these areas, otherwise nobody will produce, right? Because they are public goods, goods that display characteristics of non-rivalry and non-excludability. In terms of education, we have, it's called the merit good, if you still remember. It has positive externalities, so the government also need to give grants to encourage consumption and subsidize the consumption of merit goods as well. Another aim of the government is to distribute income in a more fair manner. That's also a micro goal, equitable income distribution. So the two micro goals are resource allocation efficiently and income distribution equitably. Alright, so some of the examples of government spending are old age pensions, unemployment benefits. So note that all these do not increase G under the AD because they do not increase output directly. It's merely a cash transfers, but these are examples of government spending. So some examples of countries with unemployment benefits, okay? These are the countries. You can go and Google what these countries are, but just take note, important is Singapore does not have unemployment benefits. Okay, so Singapore does not have unemployment benefits. Now, the third main reason for government spending is what we learned this year, and that is about economic growth. So government might want to facilitate and bring about economic growth. So this is when they would spend on economic projects, building the national stadium, building more flats and offices, so that G can increase, and then that can facilitate economic growth. So under government expenditure, there is also two aspects which you need to know, and that's under operating expenditure and development expenditure. So these two terms. So what is operating expenditure? Operating expenditure are also known as public consumption expenditure, but take note of the word public, therefore it's by the government, and they happen day to day. They are recurring activities. So for example, the payment of salaries of firemen, policemen, teachers as well. All these are examples of recurring expenditure. Other examples of recurring expenditure under operating expenditure would be the running of various agencies and ministries of the government like LTA, Health Promotion Board, HDB, etc. All the huge number of officers who work in these ministries and agencies need to be paid. And the electrical bills, all these come under government operating expenditure. Development expenditure is the next category of government expenditure, and they are also known as public investment expenditure. So this is about government projects, which are construction projects that represent a longer term investment. So for example, the construction of Changi Airport Terminal 4 and 5, Downtown Line, the Marina Coastal Expressway. Of course, Marina Coastal Expressway, MCE, is already completed. So when the government announced that they're going to build that expressway, that is one of the longest tunnel expressways ever in the world, it actually will cost a lot of money and is part of government expenditure, and it will contribute towards AD under G. Now, we have a slightly clearer idea of the various government expenditures, whether it's recurring or whether it is investment expenditure by the government for infrastructure improvements. Let's try to answer this question. Alright, the situation is this. In the financial year 2017, we know that we have a budget surplus. Alright, but the total expenditure by the ministries of Singapore in 2018 is expected to be 80 billion, 8.3% higher than financial year 2017. So which areas do you think will take up a significant portions of the budget? Which ministry will ask for the significant portions? Alright, think about it. Alright, let's go on to the answer. So this is actually the breakdown. Defense, education, transport, and health are the four key areas which are using up the main chunk of our budget. Defense, education. So in 2018, transport will overtake education because the transport sector are going to build the continuous construction of Terminal 5 as well as an extra runway at the Changi Airport will mean that the transport sector will overtake education and the overhaul of the transport network in Singapore. Okay, but of course, healthcare this year is going to take up, in 2020, is going to take up a significant portion, and healthcare will therefore rise up the ranks for this particular year. So this is about the breakdown of the possible areas of expenditure. Alright, now let's comment about Singapore's budget. So G as a percentage of GDP, look at it carefully. You realize that in as compared to other countries, of course you wouldn't know about other countries, so I'm telling you now, for Singapore's case, our G as a percentage of GDP has been relatively low because other countries usually range between 20 to 30%. In Singapore, it's usually between 13 to 17%. It's also lower than those in OECD, which range from 30 to 50%. Alright, so a lot of countries in OECD, especially the European countries, they tend to run fiscal budget deficits year to year, and that's why their G as a percentage of GDP is also huge. They spend a lot of money, contributes to GDP, but it's a vicious cycle. You contribute to GDP, but yet you are also taking a lot out of the GDP if you have to borrow to consume, borrow to spend. In Singapore's case, one of the characteristics you need to gather is our fiscal policy tends to be small or relatively smaller as compared to other countries. Alright, so checking for understanding to ensure that you have understood the content for the area so far, which is actually not very difficult stuff. So you should really go and look through again, but no need to spend so much time. They are not that critical, but it's good to know these are stuff that will be critical for the parts on the data interpretation. Okay, so do try the checking for understanding. Alright, so we are done with this, and we have talked about government expenditure. Now let's go on to taxes, alright, which is a key element. What are the objectives of taxes? Is to generate revenue for the operations of the government. Imagine if the government is only there to give money and to spend money. It will come to a day where the government runs out of money, so they will need to balance the budget, right? That's what we have said. So taxes is actually very important, and is to regulate the consumption and production of demerit goods that have negative externalities. So that's the micro goal. All right, I think the most important goal of taxes is really point number one, okay, and point number three, to affect the components of AD. So let's say when there's inflation, government would then want to reduce AD, and therefore they can tweak taxes a little bit so that they can affect AD. So we will learn about that. So knowing a little bit more about Singapore taxes, all right, taxes seems like a dirty word because it is like a fine, a monetary payment that we have to pay to the government. So which area do you think generate the most tax revenue for Singapore? Give you 15 seconds to think about it. Okay. All right. So for your interest, these are the main constituents of Singapore's revenue. So you realize that the biggest one is actually corporate income tax, and it's not personal income tax. All right. So that's why we welcome a lot of investments into Singapore, because we want to tax them 17% of their profits, and then therefore you see it makes up a huge proportion of our tax revenue collected, which is very good. Goods and services tax is very important at 17%. So the government, of course, was contemplating the idea of trying to increase the GST from 7% to 10% to help us further pay for the government expenditure, because it takes up a huge proportion and can increase. You see, betting taxes only 5%, right? Vehicle quota premium, the one on COE, is only 4%. So what are the general types of taxes that we can talk about, and the main difference between direct and indirect taxes? Okay, so direct taxes is imposed on income and wealth, whereas indirect taxes is imposed on expenditure or production of goods and services. The burden cannot be passed on to another person for direct tax, and for indirect tax, the burden can actually be passed to consumers or other stakeholders depending on PED. Alright, so all this is micro stuff. We will revisit it during dual track. Examples of direct taxes will be personal income tax, property taxes, and corporate income taxes. So these are the types of taxes which cannot be passed on to other people, and therefore this affects C and I respectively, right? Personal income tax affects C, property tax affects C and I, corporate income tax affects I, and then AD. For indirect taxes, GST, taxes on cigarettes, excise taxes on demerit goods, etc., all these taxes affect cost of production instead of AD. Okay, because these are indirect taxes, the suppliers would actually bear the burden first. So what are the different types of tax system that are available in the country that we need to look at? First one is proportional tax system. Okay, so this is a very standard type of tax system, which means like what is seen on the slide, regardless of income level, the proportion to be paid in taxes remains the same, i.e., example, corporate tax, the 17% is fixed regardless of how big the firm is. You're a small firm or a big firm, as long as you are making profits and it exceeds a particular level, you are liable to pay 17% of the tax. So this is proportionate. So corporate tax around the world is good for you to know that Singapore's corporate tax rate is at 17%, while our closest competitor Hong Kong is at 16.5%. Of course, this is old data already. USA now, it was at 35%, which is one of the highest in the world. Because remember, US spends quite a lot, the government spends quite a lot to finance for various projects. So they need the finance and the revenue to come in, and that's why they used to have 35% corporate tax. But now, of course, it has been slashed to 21%, by Donald Trump, a significant slash. Okay, China is 25%, and Malaysia as well is also at 25%. Singapore is at 17%. Next type of tax system that I want to introduce to you is progressive tax system. I think some of you are already aware, and we have talked about this before under the economic growth lecture, where we talk about how when there is higher economic growth, people will then move up the income bracket and they are liable to pay more taxes under the progressive income tax structure. So the purpose of having a progressive tax structure is to take away a larger proportion of income from those with higher income. So that's the key thing. Okay, and then the lower income group can then benefit with the income redistribution if it were to happen. Alright, so when income increases, the proportion of taxes will also increase. That's the purpose of progressive tax. So let me show you the tax structure of Singapore today. If you earn from between 0 to 20,000 a year, you are not going to be required to pay any taxes. And if you earn above 320,000, you need to pay 22% of the amount that is above 320,000 plus whatever have been accumulated. So this is what we meant by progressive income tax. Okay, can check with your teachers for more info if you want. But we get the exercise first. Alright, in activity 4, let's try to calculate the progressive tax amount. How much does person B have to pay in terms of income tax? I give you 15 seconds. Alright, so I hope you tried. If you look at the tax structure, okay, the progressive income tax structure, if the person is earning $50,000 a year, he needs to pay $1,250 to the government as income taxes. Okay, so this is the calculation that we remember. The first 20,000 is non-taxable, and thereafter the tax rates changes. Okay, and of course the tax rates increases as the income increases up the income bracket. And you realize that under this system, the proportion of income paid in tax, the $1,250 divided by 50,000 is 0.02. It's 2% as compared to 0.004. Okay, so is it fairer? In a way, people can say that yes, the rich deserves to pay a little bit more taxes, and there is it. That's why a bigger proportion of income is paid in taxes for the richer person. Alright, so under the remarks for activity 4, you realize that the amount of tax paid by person B is greater than that of person A in absolute terms. So what does this mean? It means that the person that B actually pays more, and person B actually earns more in the first place. Alright, so the proportion of income paid in tax increases as income rises. So this is the purpose of progressive income taxes. So some general comments about progressive income tax for your general knowledge. About 60% of Singaporeans actually do not pay income taxes. This includes students, elderly, etc. So this is actually a way to improve income inequity, because the more you earn, the more taxes you have to pay. But of course, from an economics point of view, this could be a disincentive to work. Why would I want to work so hard if I have to pay more taxes? So in other words, it has to be fair as well, and that's why you realize that the highest percentage in the top income bracket is only 22%. In the welfare states where they have to collect more from income taxes to finance their expenditure, the income tax rate at the top income bracket could be up to 50 to 70%, which is going to be a greater disincentive to work hard and impress. Last but not least, the type of tax rate I will introduce to you is regressive tax. Alright, so regressive tax is, the idea is this: if you earn a higher income, you actually pay a lower proportion of tax. Whereas if you earn lower income, a higher proportion of income goes to taxes. So when income of an individual increases, the proportion to be paid in taxes decrease. Now let's look at this question. Alright, I'll give you 15 seconds to work out the amount. Alright, so what is one typical example of a regressive tax? I'm sure you would have gathered by now is GST. Because regardless of your income, whether you earn any money in fact, or you earn a lot of money, you still have to pay 7% of your purchases as tax. Alright, so assuming the price of good is $100 and the tax of 9% is imposed on the sales of the good, let's see the impact on persons A and B. Alright, so 9% of $100, because that's the amount that he has to pay, is $9. He paid $9 as tax. $9 out of $1,000 that he earned is 0.009. On the other hand, person B also pays $9 as GST because it's 9% regardless of who you are, right? As long as you spend $100, for example, you pay $9. So the proportion is 9 over 5,000, and you realize that the percentage is 0.0018. Okay, so you realize that the proportion of income paid in taxes for the richer person, or the person who earns more, is smaller. Alright, so remarks for activity 5. The absolute amount of taxes paid is the same for persons A and B, but person B actually pays a smaller proportion of tax on income compared to the poorer person in person A. So let's provide you some comments about the tax reforms in Singapore. There is an increasing trend that we are shifting away from direct taxes to indirect taxes. So what the government is trying to do is we are trying to lower corporate income tax so that we can be competitive and continue to attract investments from around the world. And we want to reduce personal income tax, not that we intentionally want to benefit the rich, since the decision makers are actually the rich people. No, that's not the objective. The objective is we want to attract more rich people, creative people, innovative people, and they tend to earn more, to Singapore and work. And that's why there's a trend that we want to lower corporate and personal income tax. And we want to raise GST. It's well publicized that the government wants to increase GST from 7 to 10%. So the reasons is we want to broaden and diversify tax base. We want to ensure a sustainable tax revenue flow, and we want to create more incentive to work and earn higher income, right? You have seen for yourself under the progressive tax structure that the more you earn, the more taxes you have to pay. So we want to discourage that, and that's why we are leaning towards a little bit more towards regressive tax, where it can help us diversify tax base as well. Okay, last time people talk about, can we reduce or impose exemption of GST on necessities like rice, cooking oil, etc. But the government has said, and it sounds logical, that it's very difficult to qualify what are essentials and what are necessities. And therefore, if we were to go to that direction, it will be a huge administrative nightmare for the ministries and the civil service, because they would have to work out what is considered necessities. Therefore, they are non-examinable, they are non-taxable from GST. Alright, so now we are done with taxes. We are done with budget, we are done with government expenditure, we are done with taxes and revenue. Okay, automatic stabilizer in the map is not required for you to know under H1. Okay, so we'll go straight to discretionary fiscal policy. Alright, so like what I've said, automatic stabilizer is not important for H1. Just take note that they are just measures that are already embedded in the system to correct the economy. On the other hand, discretionary fiscal policy would be intentional, deliberate attempts by the government to tweak AD. Alright, so discretionary fiscal policy, like what I said, deliberate changes in government expenditure or taxes to affect AD. An expansionary fiscal policy involves the government raising expenditure or reducing taxes. On the other hand, a contractionary fiscal policy would involve the government cutting expenditure or raising taxes. So let's look at how they work. Expansionary fiscal policy is usually applied when the country is experiencing a recession or when the economy is operating below the full employment level. If you think about it, today in COVID-19 situation, the government is imposing a definite expansionary fiscal policy. They are trying ways and means to increase G and to reduce taxes if possible so that AD can increase, so that we can overcome an impending recession. Alright, so the aim is really to stimulate aggregate demand and bring the economy back to full employment. So that's the purpose of expansionary fiscal policy. Alright, so let's try activity 7. If you see the leftmost column, they are all fiscal policy initiatives and how these government can try to tweak and play around with fiscal tools. So I need you to go and think through within the next 30 seconds, to explain the impact and then how they will affect AD. Alright, so let's go through the answers. With a reduction in personal income tax, it increases disposable income, and then this will of course increase C and increase AD. With a reduction in corporate tax, it will increase after-tax profits. These are the typical explanation that we have gone through under the very first topic that I lectured with you about the intro to macroeconomy using ADS analysis. And so what will increase? Which component of AD will increase? I, right? I will increase, AD increase, and now we know that when I increase, LRAS will also increase in the long term. Alright, increase in government expenditure. So in examples like when government spends and build bridges, build schools and hospitals, these are examples of increase in government expenditure. This will increase G and increase AD. Alright, so these are the respective explanations and the impact on AD. So taken together, there's an increase in AD, and then depending on which state of the economy they are at, they will then create economic growth. So some remarks for activity 7. So just take note, the impact on NY will depend on the extent of increase in C and I, which makes sense, right? It's not necessary that NY will increase by a lot whenever tax rates will decrease or when G increase, because it still depends on the extent of increase in C and I, how responsive the consumers and investors are. Size of the multiplier. Okay, we sort of talked about this before, so I will explain a little bit more in the next lecture, as well as the state of the economy. Right? Are you nearing full employment? Or are you far away from full employment and therefore there is a lot of potential for you to grow in terms of real GDP? So let's look at the graphical illustration of the expansionary fiscal policy. So this is the level where full employment is. Alright, this one we know already. And this is where there is massive unemployment. This is what we call the Keynesian range, and then the intermediate range. and then the original AD is here, giving us the original price and output level. So it is very likely that when the country is contemplating and planning for an expansionary fiscal policy, that the economy will be at the Keynesian range, at the horizontal part of the AS curve. Why? Because if the economy is at the full employment level, why would the government think of expanding the economy further with a fiscal policy? Because it will only cause demand pull inflation, right? So coming back to this, when AD0 is here and we implement an expansionary fiscal policy, this is what happens. AD0 increases to AD1, and you realize that there's an increase in prices, but what's more important is there is an increase in GDP from Y0 to Y1. Or in other words, the economy has moved to full employment with the implementation of expansionary fiscal policy. So isn't this awesome? So now we know. We have talked about issues like inflation, we have talked about issues like economic growth and unemployment. So if you're just by looking at how expansionary fiscal policy works, I can bring in the three macro problems together. When the country is facing recession, an increase in expansionary fiscal policy can bring the economy to full employment, and thereafter more jobs will need to be created, more jobs will be filled up, and therefore unemployment will fall. Although prices might rise. Okay, so if AD were to continue to increase, let's say this expansionary fiscal policy is super effective, AD continue to rise, then that's when prices will start rising with no increase in GDP. And so what's the solution? The solution will be the opposite of expansionary fiscal policy, and that is a contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, so back to this diagram, you realize that through the multiplier process, the national income will increase from Y0 all the way to Y1, bring the economy to full employment. Of course, it doesn't happen just straight away. It happened over a period of time. Alright, so what if the expansionary fiscal policy is too effective? Like what I've explained in the previous slide, now we'll show you in the form of graphical illustration. So let's say AD0, yes, the country was facing a recession, the government implemented an expansionary fiscal policy that is too effective, that shoots AD up all the way to AD1. Okay, you realize that there's going to be inflation from P0 to P1. But of course, as what we have always encouraged and asked you to do, to explain expansionary fiscal policy causing demand pull inflation, you need one more AD. Okay, you need 3 ADs from AD0 to AD1 to AD2. So where's AD2 going to be? It has to be on the upward side or the rightward hand side of AD1. Okay, so that's the diagram of demand pull inflation which Miss Chiu lectured in her price stability lecture. Alright, so my point here for this slide is if the expansionary fiscal policy is too effective, it's also a problem, and that's why government cannot just implement wholesale a super big expansionary fiscal policy. They have to be mindful of the state of the economy as well, besides whether they can afford it too. Alright, but what if the expansionary fiscal policy is not strong enough? You realize that AD0 increases to just AD1. Although national income increases from Y0 to Y1, you realize that it is still a distance away from full employment, and therefore we cannot be able to say that we have gotten out of recession, and therefore this dosage of expansionary FP could be not strong enough. So this is what we want to talk about state of the economy. So when you are trying to draw for fiscal policy and how it works, take note you should draw it as you should implement it during a recession, and therefore it should be at the horizontal part of the AS curve, and then take note of how much you should increase it and whether it moves to full employment or not. Okay, so this is something for you to ponder about for effectiveness of FP.